glad that he was willing to present for us today. He's prepared 30 minutes, so there's going to be a fair amount of time for Q&A at the end. So I encourage you all to put your questions in the Q&A window and stick around for a fruitful discussion following his presentation.
Great, thanks, Megan. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Lasky. I'm the Director of Fire Management for the Forest Stewards Guild. The Guild is a national nonprofit and dedicated to promoting ecological, economic, and socially responsible forestry. And in the last couple of years, we've spooled up a fire management program. And so I want to thank everybody for attending, and I'm going to make an assumption that by virtue of finding your way here to this webinar, I really want to thank everybody also for the work they do. I will talk a lot here in a moment about how I think we're at an important inflection point. And everybody here who's joining this webinar is part of the successes that we've had. And then I also want to say that in putting this webinar together, I've borrowed liberally from other people's work. And so if I miss, I've tried to cite information as much as possible and would be happy to share citations afterwards. But if I miss a citation, it's an error of omission, not of intent. So I guess apologies up front. So in 1935, the Forest Service established what they called their 10 a.m. policy. And the policy essentially decreed that every fire should be suppressed by 10 a.m. the following day. And quickly, almost all the other federal land agencies followed suit. And so really by 1936, we had really set the table for the catastrophic wildfires that we're all familiar with today. And so I'm going to posit and ask you all to embrace that I think we are now at the most important inflection point in fire management since 1935. I think things have changed, as you can see here. Things like the campfire have fundamentally altered, I think, the national conversation about wildland fire. And I think it is as meaningful as that land management decision almost 100 years ago. And so, you know, I think for most folks at this point, it's really it's an accepted thing that climate change is here. I don't want to delve into politics, but I do a lot of work on the Front Range of Colorado and down in the Santa Fe, Albuquerque areas of New Mexico. And 15 years ago in Colorado, the conversation was absolutely from folks, hey, I didn't move into the mountains to cut trees. I don't want to see my neighbors. And it was a challenging conversation to get people to wrap their head around the fact that they were living in a fire-prone ecosystem. And now, 15 years later, I think starting with the 4 Mile Fire, but then High Park Fire, Waldo Canyon, Black Forest, this year's Spring Fire, I talk to residents in all over the place in communities like the Front Range of Colorado, which is the poster child for catastrophic wildfire in the WUI, and has really accepted that that it's no longer a question of if, but when. And so I think that's a really significant shift. The other thing that I think most folks have also accepted is that not only is it a question of you know, when, but that when is now longer and when is also larger. And that it doesn't take much to spend time on the national news and see that fire takes a place on the national stage in a way in which I'm not sure it really did since Yellowstone burned. And I want to try and be precise in my language in terms of what we're going to talk about. I don't, you know, there are approximately, since 1997, over 1.5 million wildfires that started. As you can see, very few of them actually grow to the size that they are, quote unquote, kind of catastrophic. And so really only 1 to 2% of all the fires that start wind up causing really about 90% of the problems. And I want to, for the purposes of this webinar, focus, perhaps unfairly, but focus on that 1 and 2%. But I think it's important to say that the vast majority of the ignitions in the United States haven't been what set this table for this inflection point. And so, you know, I think we've got this very unique moment in time, this tipping point, but there's some really critical components that are missing, and there's some systems level trends that we're all, you know, all impacted by that are outside of our control. And I want to kind of get after those to start, because I think there's some really interesting stuff here for us to play with. So the first is what many folks call the silver tsunami. And the basic idea is that the baby boomers, as we all know, are aging, but they're aging in a way in which I think will have impacts on fire management that we haven't fully addressed. And so you can see here, right, that the population of folks over 60 in the next 40 years, or next 30 years rather, will double. And I think we need to sit with that for a moment, right? You know, we're seeing triple-digit increases in folks who are older than 70 years old. And so the doubling in size of our nation's elderly population is something that I think we need to really, really think about from a perspective of how we manage fire. And so, as an example, for those of you who have been tracking things like the Camp Fire, over 600,000 Americans over the age of 70 will stop driving every year. 600,000 folks will stop driving every year. And as this image shows, that creates a completely different dynamic for how we engage wildfire and community protection, but also I think even more importantly, it is going to change community resilience. And this is something that I think is really underestimated, that when the average age of your population changes, their ability to deal with natural disaster also changes. And you know, by some estimates, almost 80% of the folks who will be aging baby boomers because of growth into the WUI will be 80% of those folks will be living in places where the only option for transportation is personal cars. And so, you know, I think what this means is, in 1950, the National Bureau of Research just put out a working paper about the impacts of disaster at the community level, kind of the community and county level. And in 1950, fewer than 20% of all U.S. counties experienced disaster. In 2018, that number changed to just under 50%. So almost half of our counties nationally. Now this incorporates hurricanes, floods, tornadoes. So wildfire is only a portion of it, but it means that there's this massive change because of climate change that our counties are going to have to confront greater incidents of disaster, while simultaneously we have an aging population that's going to have increasing needs and a decreasing ability to perhaps take care of themselves. And so I'm trying to kind of set the stage here for where we'll go with the rest of the webinar. But I think another dynamic that folks are beginning to accept is that we are not going to use chainsaws. We are not going to cut our way out of our fire problem. I don't think we can necessarily afford it. I think it takes too darn long. And I think it just can't happen at the scale that the fire problem exists at. So I'm going to go back and forth with a couple of slides here, but I want folks to kind of try and appreciate what I think the scope of this problem is. So if we look at this map of federal lands, we see, kind of obviously a much larger density of federal lands in the western half of the United States. So this is our federal lands. But now what I want you to kind of think about is that the Forest Service manages about 193 million acres. The WUI, the growth rate of homes into the wildland-urban interface, has created a scenario where we have now 190 million acres that are classified as WUI. So what we've got is essentially the same amount of land that the Forest Service manages is how much WUI we have. And I think we just need to accept the scope at which, or the scale at which this problem exists. So and I'm going to go back and forth because I think it's interesting to look at where our federal lands are, and then in the dark red, where our WUI growth is. And although it's not a perfect one-for-one, it makes sense how we've had 43 million new homes built in the WUI in the last 20 years. And so this is going to change again. This is all part of that inflection point. This changes the political dynamics and the realities of fire management in ways in which the decision to extinguish fires 100 years ago, I think maybe even dwarfs that. Another thing that I want to talk about, because I think we don't necessarily do a great job, and again, I know we have a diversity of experience on the webinar today. I don't think we do a great job of communicating how houses are actually lost in the wildland-urban interface. And so I think most folks have this image that, and again, this is a national thing, that homes are lost to crown fire. And that when we look at an image like this, where we try and get folks in the WUI to mitigate their risk, most homeowners wind up thinking mostly about Zone 3. And unfortunately, Dr. Jack Cohen's research is I think, irrefutable now. Homes aren't lost to crown fire as a general rule. They're not lost to this priority Zone 3 area. They're lost because of embers that wind up in Zone 1 and on that house itself. And so here are some images from the 4 Mile fire where you'll see, right? We have burned house surrounded by green trees. Burned house surrounded by green trees. Burned house surrounded by green trees. So I think it's irrefutable that it wasn't crown fire that took these structures, it was ember cast. And then finally, because we're in Colorado, you'll see here that folks are instructed, I guess, to move valuable things out of their house when they evacuate, and those plants are exactly what you think they are in Colorado. I also want to talk about the fact that I think words really matter when we're in this process of communicating, and that not only do we need to do a better job of explaining how homes are lost and then focusing on issues of building materials and landscaping within the first 5 feet of the houses, we also need to be careful, I think, as practitioners about how we use words like fire breaks and fuel breaks. So I think the public has a very strong image that this fire break right here will work. And in many instances it does. Here's a good day. This fuel break is staffed, the wind's going in the right direction, and I suspect this will hold. But on many days, this is the kind of fire behavior that we have. And fuel breaks like this no longer hold. And so I think we do ourselves a real disservice as a community when we let the community, let the general population assume that, we can contain these catastrophic fires. And so I think the research is really beginning to come out that in, again, these 1% and 2% fires, fuel breaks don't work. If we go back and look at this, right, in the presence of half-mile spotting, 40-mile-an-hour winds, this fuel break will not hold on its own. So instead, what I think is an important concept that we should embrace, and again, none of this is my work, but there are a number of folks working around this idea of pods or potential operational delineations. And I think potential operational delineations is almost as cumbersome as WUI in terms of a communication issue. But I think the word pods work because it makes sense. And the idea of a pod is that we are able to use landscape features, built environment features to say, this is a place under the right conditions where we can engage a fire. And so it changes the conversation from fuel break, which seems like a fixed thing that will work, to a potential area where if things go right, we can engage. And we could do an entire webinar just on pods, but I think this is an important thing to put out there in terms of the context of the tipping point that I think we're at. And then I think, you can't talk about wildland fire or prescribed fire and not talk about smoke. And I think communities are beginning to get the idea that there isn't a no smoke option. The way in which wildfire is present in the national conversation now, people understand. But there's a really troubling duality right now. Because if you actually look at the data for the average American on the average day, the air is a lot cleaner than it's ever been before. I mean, dramatically cleaner. That the PM2.5 and ozone is down 65% since 1999. So our air is actually getting better, while simultaneously we have these catastrophic smoke events. And this is based on some modeling as opposed to actual data. But there's some modeling that indicates that in 2018, the California wildfires released as much PM2.5, which is the most problematic carcinogen. So the wildfires released as much PM2.5 as all of the vehicles in California in the same year. So these catastrophic smoke events are creating really significant public health issues, while simultaneously our air is actually getting better. And the problem is that one of the reasons why this is actually an estimate is that Class 1 airsheds in non-attainment areas like Denver here are required to track their air pollution every day except during days that are considered acts of God, of which wildfires are one. So we have a scenario here where our air is getting cleaner, which should actually, I think, create some decision space for us as managers. But we're not collecting the data we need to be collecting because we don't need to for air quality attainment, or we're not collecting it as robustly as we should. So I think, one thing that I want to challenge everybody on the webinar to do is that I think air quality regulators haven't kept pace with the change from what Denver used to look like to what's now the case with these catastrophic smoke events. So my challenge is find someone at the county or state level who's a public health official and take them out to coffee. I think we have really significant inroads that we can make with our partners in air quality and public health. We just haven't done it yet. And then I think it's also really important that we address the idea that smoke is a social justice issue and it disproportionately impacts folks at the bottom half of the socioeconomic spectrum. And there is some really interesting research by a social psychologist, John Yost, who looked at economic disparity and developed a theory of systems justification, which basically states that we're motivated to rationalize the status quo as legitimate. And when he did some surveying, he found that folks at the bottom half of the socioeconomic brackets were almost 20% more likely to see economic inequality as necessary than those at the top. And so what that points to is, I think, actual data that proves my experience in both Santa Fe and Boulder, Colorado, which is just flat out say, wealthy people get really grumpy about smoke. And the thing is that they actually are used to being able to control their environments. And so they'll reach out to their public officials. And what I've seen when we're burning in more rural areas is that folks in more rural areas are more used to the fact that things just happen to them. And this is what this systems justification research would seem to indicate. And so I think as managers, another thing to put out there is that we've got a wicked problem to solve. Smoke is part of that wicked problem, but there's also an onus on us that we're very careful about smoke. I think sometimes when we burn in the difficult areas like Boulder, less careful perhaps in other areas. And I think that's just an awareness issue that we need to be cognizant of. So I guess the question is, where does this leave us? And, we've got this unique inflection point, and I'll just run through all the things that are wrong and against us. And so not surprisingly, right, I'm going to tell you that I think prescribed fire is the tool that needs to be used to solve these problems. I think prescribed fire is not the only tool in the toolbox. I want to be very clear about that. It is not the only tool, but I think it is a unique tool in the sense that it is the most cost-effective tool at a landscape scale. And unlike some other tools out there, prescribed fire does some things like reintroducing a truly natural process to an ecosystem, the most important ecological disturbance in many of our landscapes. And it actually removes fuels as opposed to just rearranging them. So I think prescribed fire is the way to go. And to run through quickly some basic concepts around it, I think it's very clear that prescribed fire provides opportunities for watershed health in a way in which other tools don't. And as an example, I'll use the Rio Grande Water Fund. And the Rio Grande Water Fund is a nature conservancy program that looks to restore 600,000 acres in 20 years. And they look to restore those acres in a catchment area that provides drinking water for almost half of the population of New Mexico. So how do we protect drinking water for half the population of New Mexico? There are many tools, but when we're looking at 600,000 acres in 20 years, prescribed fire, I think, is the only viable option to do it at that scale. I think it's also important that we think about reintroducing better ecological function. And one thing that I've come to tell folks that I work with now is if houses are your only metric and you want to produce your house, put a metal roof on your house and put 5 feet of gravel around your house. But if you want to live in something other than a moonscape after high severity fire potentially moves through your property, then looking to do ecological restoration is equally as important. So I want to talk briefly about how we get there. I'm not quite sure about the entire experience on the webinar about the process of prescribed fire. I think the thing that we, again, do a very poor job of articulating to the public is that really the cornerstone to prescribed fire is aggressive planning, the idea of aggressive planning and patient implementation. And so really the only thing that separates me from an arsonist is the objectives and the planning that I put in place in front of a fire. And then we've got some now very, very effective implementation techniques. We're in a situation where obviously the fear on prescribed fire is that it escapes and we have another Cerro Grande or other lower North Fork fire, and less than 0.1% of all prescribed fires escape. And then I think this is all part of it, right? We need to do a better job of monitoring and storytelling. Now, obviously, prescribed fire isn't without its own barriers to implementation. So prescribed fire can be costly. As a general rule, I think although it is much more cost effective on a large acreage scale than any other technique, it's still a costly proposition. And as we're making our adjustments, some of our funding mechanisms are not well suited to providing for the cost of prescribed fire. We also have another really wicked problem, which is in this era of catastrophic fire, it in some sense, I suppose, is only human nature to feel like if you're a qualified firefighter, shouldn't you be saving people's homes? And so much of our workforce, almost most of our workforce, unfortunately, gets sucked into the process of fire suppression. And saving homes is important work, but it means that we don't have the workforce that we need to get after prescribed fire. So I think the question becomes, how do we develop and decouple the workforce, right? How do we, in a average fire season, at the peak of fire season, we have approximately 50,000 suppression firefighters in the field working. And at that number, we're actually mobilizing active duty military. And we need twice that many firefighters to be able to do prescribed fire and suppression fire in the same way. So how do we do that? And I think one step is that we need to think about creating a diverse and inclusive workforce. I think another thing that's been in the news recently is that the Forest Service, as well as other federal land management agencies, are struggling to have a workforce that's welcoming to, frankly, folks who are not white and male. And so one way in which we will double our workforce is by inviting more people into being fire practitioners. And I think diversity is a really important thing. It's not just that it's socially just, but it'll also make for better fire. And the reason I believe that is there's I'll tell a small story. We've been trying as a society to address a variety of prenatal issues for a long time, right? And low birth weight, and other issues associated with pregnancy and childbirth globally are a real problem. And so the story is that there's a young expecting mother in a doctor's office having an ultrasound, and it crosses her mind that the ultrasound does a great job of measuring the baby, but why are they not measuring the mom more if they're concerned about prenatal issues? And if we pull on some threads here, it turns out that this mom who's having the ultrasound is a professor at MIT, and she's a professor in mechanical engineering. And so she's in a position to honestly, I think, have thoughts that perhaps were not had by men in the same scenario. Now, obviously, this is a function of STEM. This is a function of a lot of issues, but I think it's a really basic idea around diversity, that a woman who was trained in testing railroad ties is now testing uterine tissue using the same lab machinery to test for strength. And so I think that's one example of, I don't know all of the issues that diversity will help solve fire, but I can say as a 20-year fire practitioner, it is not currently a diverse community. We're not solving all of our own problems, and so this seems to me to be only a logical place to turn. And so finally, what I'm going to ask folks to kind of embrace as I conclude here is that at roughly the same time that the Forest Service was putting in their 10 a.m. rule, the nation did something really, I think, truly spectacular. And the Roosevelt administration created the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA. And for a generation, we had an entire generation lifted out of poverty, in part, out of the Depression, in part by the creation of good blue-collar jobs when they were desperately needed. And there's a lot of good research that actually most of that was facilitated by some financial mechanisms that are still at our disposal. And so there's been a lot, I think, recently in the public conversation about how we need better blue-collar jobs. And in 1970, blue-collar jobs were over 30% of our total employment. By 2016, they had fallen to just over 13%. And so I would posit the way that we're going to solve our blue-collar job problem is by creating the restoration economy. Creating 50,000 additional firefighters is one step to addressing the fact that we can lift folks up to economic security through the restoration economy. So this is a photo of a group of young firefighters from northern New Mexico who we've worked with. And I will tell you that I think these folks are the future. And to loop back to demographics for a moment, a very important dynamic is that as our population ages on one end, the millennials are coming to their full economic strength on the other. And that we have a generation in the millennials who are easy to disparage in some cases, but have both the size and the inclination to solve problems that they're inheriting that they didn't create. And so as I come to the end, I'm going to ask folks to think a little bit about what Bill McKeeben said, and he was referring to climate change more broadly, but his point was that to succeed slowly is to fail. And hence why I conclude with this idea that prescribed fire is an emergency. Old foresters used to talk about storing lumber on the stump, that if you hadn't cut timber, you could store it on the stump. Well, I think now what's happened is we're storing risk on the stump. And every day that we don't treat our landscapes is another day that we're positioned for catastrophic fire. And so until we reframe our conversation and view prescribed fire as big and important an emergency as suppression fire, I don't believe we're going to make progress. And so I suppose since a webinar wouldn't be a webinar without a little shameless self-promotion, part of what I'm doing personally is trying to address this issue. And I work with the Gravitas Peak Wildland Fire Module, and we are training 18 to 25-year-olds from underserved and underrepresented backgrounds. And we are in our small way starting to build that restoration economy workforce. So I apologize, I'm not very good at multitasking, but it looks to me like there's been a bunch of activity on the chat board and questions. And so I'm gonna wrap it up here and turn it back over to Megan and see if we can't have a conversation.
That sounds great, Dave. Yeah, so if you go ahead and you can keep sharing your screen, or not, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then go ahead and click on the Q&A window. One person just asked, Chuck asked if you'd be willing to share your slideshow. I know we're recording this, but if you could share your slideshow, that might help people just sort of grab those links a little bit easier if you had some in there. And if that's
yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I'd be more than happy to share.
Awesome. So can you see that Q&A?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So we might just start from the top. And just a reminder, folks, we have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A window. If you put them in the chat window, we might lose them. So I don't want that to happen.
Yeah. So there's a question about fire-resistant landscaping and plants and whether they're pointless. I think that the research that Jack Cohen and others have done would speak to more issues actually around maintenance, issues like removing pine needles from from gutters, and getting folks to remove their wood decks, elevated wood decks. And so I think fire-resistant plants are probably an important, if you will, kind of an important gateway drug that it allows folks to continue to have xeric landscaping that makes them feel good about their homes without posing undue risk. So I think it's a worthwhile trade-off, because I think there are bigger issues with structure loss that we need to address.
I can read Bo's comment.
Yep.
And Bo, I can't grab anything. I can't grab that URL. So if you want to cut and paste that URL into the chat window, that would be really helpful. So Bo Larkin says, sorry, not a question, but wanted to share that researchers at the University of Montana found persistent effects of wildfire smoke a year after the Rice Ridge fire in Seeley Lake. He agrees about the social justice issues of smoke and the danger posed by tiny particulate. I don't know, I'm not familiar with the Rice Ridge fire when that burned, but.
Yeah, no, but I do, and I want to loop back to, I think that one thing that we need to do, and again, this is way above perhaps my area of influence, but I think we need to be able to provide the data on how damaging wildfire smoke is. And I think we can then, it's very hard to measure avoidance, but I think there is room in the national conversation to talk about avoidance and how prescribed fire and other tools can prevent this harmful wildfire smoke. I think the data is there.
Ed has a comment, lots of data probably on air quality in Alberta, Calgary over the last 2 summers from the forest fires in BC. He agrees there's a need for technology for residences, for air cleaning on house, air intake, especially if children or asthmatics live in the home.
Yeah. And Megan, so one thing that I would be, I think, also important for us to address that I skipped over in my presentation, but I'm very proud of my colleagues at the Forest Stewards Guild who have been instrumental in pursuing a bit of a new model, which is when we do prescribed fires now, we also bring HEPA filters with us to the communities that are impacted by the prescribed fire. And these HEPA filters are not terribly expensive. They don't clean the air in an entire house, but they will clean the air, for example, in someone's bedroom. At nighttime, we know smoke settles. And so the ability to sleep in clean air, I think, is a really important service that we need to kind of provide in tandem as fire practitioners.
You can go ahead and address Amanda's.
Yeah. So, so I guess,
Amanda.
Yeah, so if fire is a natural process, how necessary is it for a fire to, compared to natural fire? I think actually where I hope we can get to is this idea of managing fires and allowing natural fires to burn more frequently, also acknowledging that in the wrong conditions, both in terms of weather and fuel loading, some fires should be suppressed and extinguished. So I think what's happened is that we have, in many cases, ecosystems where the most important disturbance hasn't been allowed to happen for 100 years, not at least effectively. And so we're not yet to a place where we can allow just a simple natural process to occur. And I hate to say it, but I think it may be 10 times harder to fix the problem that we created. I'm not sure that's a straight answer, but.
Carl had a question about any thoughts on using drones and other robotic measures to manage fires?
Yeah, so there are many people out there who know much more about this than I do, but I've now been able to be involved with a number of prescribed fires where we're using drones for monitoring, and I think that's a really exciting technology. And I think that in 5 years, we'll also see the ability to do large landscape scale ignitions from unmanned aerial platforms. I think drones have the potential to also be a significant game changer for us in the next 10 years, both in terms of both firefighter safety and firefighter efficiency. I think in terms of how can we burn enough acreage with prescribed fire to make a difference at a landscape level? You know, I think that I guess I would turn that question on its head and say that, again, my experience as a firefighter is that oftentimes fire breaks don't work as well as we'd like them to. And I think we see that, right, again, in these catastrophic fires, traditional measures are not working. So I think treating in advance is the way to go. And again, I don't want to just offer opinion, but I think that several things need to occur. One is that we need to build social acceptance for fire. We need to build the workforce to be able to do it at scale. And then we need to do it. And again, the Forest Service research would clearly indicate on a per acre cost, we can do prescribed fire at the 10,000 acre scale. I don't know that we can do mechanical removal of fuels at that scale. So maybe that's seen as a difference of opinion, but I think the data points in that direction.
Helen had a question. What was the percentage of controlled burns that get away from it? Controlled.
Yeah. So some of that, some of the data around escape prescribed fires is hard to accurately talk about because the collection mechanisms for the data is not great. But based on the research that the Guild has done, it's less than one tenth of 1%. So 0.01% of all prescribed ignitions, quote unquote, escape.
I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll really quick. We still have 330 people on the webinar right now. So if you want to move that off your screen before you take the poll, go for it, folks. But I'm going to launch it right now and hope that you all vote before you leave our meeting room. Karen was wondering, what was the name of that MIT professor? Did you hear that story on NPR? I think I heard the same story.
I did, yeah. And so that's one of those things where I should be prepared to say, I'll get back to you with that information. But if you do a little bit of search on npr.org, you'll find within the last 2 weeks or something. Yep. Morning edition. I guess that shows that I procrastinated a little bit on putting my webinar together.
No. So Bo had a question. How can private landowners and land managers help? How can they implement prescribed fire? There is tremendous acreage and private ownership that also needs prescribed fire, but the planning, implementation, and liability associated might be pretty overwhelming. I would point folks to the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, the people that brought you to us today. I mean, these networks exist, and our liaison, Gloria Edwards, is currently in DC right now lobbying for funding to continue to do that good work of the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network. So that's one idea, but go for it, Dave. Feel free.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think that what we need, again, this is going to be a massive effort. And so I think we need to start with organizations like state level prescribed fire councils, which are a great place to get information. Many of the Western university extension services also have information. I'll put again a shameless plug in. The Nature Conservancy hosts TREX programs where you can actually personally participate in prescribed fire and build some of the domain expertise to then knowledgeably kind of catalyze your community. So I think there's actually quite a bit of resource out there, but I do think that starting with a state level prescribed fire council or with the Southern Rockies Exchange will get you pointed in the right direction.
Utah just formed our first prescribed fire council within the last month. So we'll have some information about that on our website, and I'll actually be building that out of our website. So that's good news for Utah anyways. Karen asked also, what about the potential to use managed fire as a tool in the restoration economy? She's thinking we may have the potential to treat even more acres than prescribed fire that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think again, the kind of golden chalice here is to be able to manage fire and let fire move naturally across the landscape. And I think the formula for that is using some of our other tools, being mechanical thinning and prescribed fire, to build buffers around WUI communities. And then once those buffers are built, the decision space for doing managed fire is much greater. And so Karen, I agree 100% that managed fire is where we need to get to. But again, to manage fire, we need a workforce in place that isn't dedicated to suppression. Because those suppression firefighters, we had an experience this year where in New Mexico after the monsoon, we actually got a natural ignition, a lightning strike within the boundaries of what was going to be a prescribed fire. So it was exactly where we wanted it, and it was still suppressed and extinguished because all the available resources were in, again, rightfully so, in Washington State and Idaho on suppression events. So it's not to say that we should lose homes, it's to say we need to double the size of the workforce.
We have a millennial that tuned in.
Yeah.
As a millennial, the issues you brought up are 100% of things on their mind and the mind of many people his or her age. I know, both in the field and otherwise. So how do we as a fire community allow those voices to be heard when many of us in that age group concerned about those issues are not in positions of power in the industry?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, that's a multi-layered issue. You know, I think one of the most exciting things about millennials is that they'll be the most diverse generation in the history of the United States. And so I think what that means is that the traditional channels that we're currently using will not be the channels that will get used long term. I think that one of the most important things that will also happen, and it's happening, right? I mean, I think we're seeing it, and again, I don't want to talk politics, I just want to talk demographics, that as millennials become county commissioners, conversations like prescribed fire will change. And so I think that millennials, you know, again, they may be closed out a little bit at the moment, but I think that's going to change. That's probably not a very good answer, but.
Sounds like you're telling people to run for office.
A little bit, yeah.
Hey, can you talk about how you've overcome some of the paperwork liability in state and feds letting NGOs participate and challenges you've overcome in that sort of?
Yeah, Becca, I should thank you for the softball question. Although it's a bit of a long answer, but the way in which we've overcome a lot of these issues is just through diligent partnerships with other NGOs, engaging our federal partners as much as possible. The Nature Conservancy, the Chalma Peak Land Alliance, the Guild, and a couple of others are involved in working with the state legislature in New Mexico, as an example, to actually change state statute around liability and negligence. We're not there yet, but we're working there. Maybe I should have done the whole webinar about how you actually get liability insurance. But you know, I think the first step is to build partnership groups. And you know, Becca, I know you know some of the folks to reach out to. And then in those partnership groups, I think there's real power, and that's the start.
Can the Forest Service and other agencies recruit at colleges? I mean, I don't know if you know the answer to that. Where should the funding come from to increase firefighter positions and training?
Right. I can certainly speak to that second half, which is the reason I bring up the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA is that I think the funding absolutely positively has to come through public-private partnerships. And we talk about increasing spending for infrastructure. We've done it before as a nation, and I think we can do it again. And I think it could be incredibly cost-effective to find a small amount of taxpayer dollars to have a great deal of impact. So I think, again, just like the Roosevelt administration, through political might, created the CCC, we've got a model that's worked before and we can do it again. So that's my answer about where the funding comes from. And I think both federal and state level are possibilities.
You talked about a home looking like a moonscape and said that to solve this, you can restore vegetation around the home. Can you speak more to this technique?
Yeah. So again, very, very briefly, what we I think it's a two-step process. In the WUI, and again, the devil's in the details a little bit, but in the WUI, particularly in Ponderosa, kind of the Ponderosa belt, which is the bulk of the WUI, not all of it, but a lot of the WUI. I think the appropriate tactics are to come in and hand thin. I think it's on these smaller units, it is an appropriate tool. But my experience has been as a suppression firefighter that you can remove a lot of the standing fuels. And if you don't then reintroduce fire to the system, which is a challenge in the WUI, but can be done, you need to then reintroduce fire to address the surface fuels and the fuels that are rearranged by the hand thinning to actually really remove the potential for moonscape. And so I don't know that we have time to talk about it, but there are, I think, a number of good documented cases where hand thinning has been done, catastrophic fire has moved through, wrong fire, wrong day, and that fire has still laddered up into the canopy and caused catastrophic high severity fire. So I think reintroducing lower intensity fire after hand thinning is the way to address that issue. In the WUI, specifically in the WUI.
Ian was wondering about your interaction, particularly with landowners. How have you avoided or how have you been successful in working with landowners?
Right. Again, I think it goes back a little bit to what I was saying earlier, both with consortiums of nonprofits. The way we've done it is, and the way I've seen it done, it's not just me. I mean, I've seen it done successfully throughout the fire practitioner community, is by working with groups that are on the ground, whether it's NRCS or a watershed protection group, but folks who know other people on a first name basis. And they kind of become the conduit between some of the fire practitioners and some of the landowners. And so fire practitioners, who kind of carpet bag their way in may not be the answer, but I think the short answer is there are lots of great on the ground organizations who can do that sort of consensus building.
There seems to be a lot of questions just about like the nuts and bolts about how to go about doing this, putting prescribed fire on the ground. So Gloria and I are thinking about a webinar sort of symposium that would be maybe 3 hours long and have a bunch of people from different agencies talk about how to get these things done on the ground. And so just a thought for those 300 people that are still in the webinar, if we don't get to your question, keep your eyes open for a symposium that the Southern Rockies Fire and Science Network and I may be collaborating on in the future. There's a specific question about the pods. How much opportunity do you think there is in using these pods for putting more good fire on the ground during wildfire events? I didn't know that. Go ahead.
Sorry, I think there's enormous possibility. I think there's and again, I would be happy to field questions and point folks in the right directions. Pods are not my area of expertise, but there are folks at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute who are working on this on a daily basis who could easily answer that question.
So there's another question just about the nuts and bolts. How does one get, I agree the prescribed fire is the best tool for the job of minimizing risk, but how does this get paid for and who takes on the liability? So there's just a lot of, right?
There's a lot to that. Very, very briefly, I would say follow the money. And right now, I think to burn at scale, right? It may not be who's funding, but to burn at scale, we need to look at the biggest stakeholders, which in many cases are the water providers. So we've got, for example, the Rio Grande Water Fund is an example of that, where they funnel money from, among others, water providers. I think the insurance industry, as they see more catastrophic loss, there's some really big financial players who have a lot of skin in the game. And if we're going to burn at scale, it's going to be insurance, watershed, and then states who no longer tolerate the kind of catastrophic loss.
Just a quick note, there's a bunch of people speaking with each other in the chat window. Make sure you're clicking the down arrow. If you want other attendees to see your conversation and your comments, click the down arrow for all panelists and attendees. If you just click all panelists, the only people that are going to see your very thoughtful comments are me and Dave. And I'm happy to see them, but I think you're trying to speak to other people as well. Eric has a question. How many acres across the West would you posit would benefit from prescribed fire? Just a ballpark, I guess.
Yeah, so that is a, just a total wag. You know, I think there's 100 million. I think if we assume that the Forest Service manages 193 million acres, obviously not all of those forests are necessarily fire adapted, but that begins to 200 million, acres when we start looping in private land. I don't think is a outrageous estimate.
I'm just trying to see if there's any questions. Somebody's asking about specifically, is there money available to incorporate trained wildland fire personnel from areas far from the work area? This person asks because Chicago has a training program that includes wildland fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there are, again, I don't think prescribed fire is funded at the rate that it needs to be, but there are a number of mechanisms. Again, this might be maybe that 3-hour webinar, but there absolutely are mechanisms to get trained fire personnel from distance. It's hard to do, but opportunities do exist.
Mark just has a nuts and bolts question. Where can we get info to share with our clients about defensible space, fire safe building materials, example siding, as well as roofing materials, sprinkler systems for rooftops to have ready during the wildfire?
Right. So here in Colorado, the Colorado State Forest Service provides a lot of that information. FireWise provides a lot of that information. I'm sure through almost every state extension service in the West, there's information. I mean, very good graphics, trifold handouts, all that sort of stuff.
We have a FireWise booklet that is available on our website too. So often what I do after these webinars, when we have a bunch of people with specific questions, I'll email everybody with a list of links. So maybe some key things that we've had people ask about a bunch of times, I'll send out a blanket email to everybody. So that might be something to keep your eye out for, Mark. Somebody just asked a question. Can you define those pods again, please?
Yeah, so POD stands for Potential Operational Delineations. And so it's using things like roads, rivers, ridge lines to essentially build polygons where firefighters can either engage a fire or otherwise create boundaries around certain types of fire management. And again, I would be happy to, maybe when we put out that email, direct folks to folks far more knowledgeable than I am.
So maybe we should see, we still have 270 people on the webinar and 14 questions, and I'm pretty sure we're not going to get through all of them, but a ecological question. Can you tell us more about how prescribed fires contribute to watershed health? Yeah.
So there, I think starting at the perhaps most meaningful is high severity fire does a number of things that, for example, Denver Water is still dealing with sediment issues from the Hayman fire of 2002 in Cheeseman Reservoir, right? So when we have high severity fire, it means that we get oftentimes mud slides and debris flows that destroy water infrastructure, as well as do real damage to natural water courses, hitting fish populations and stuff like that. So preventing that catastrophic loss is the first step. The other thing that we see, I think this is fascinating, is there was a new study just published about how when the pine duff layer gets really, really thick, and that pine duff layer would be removed by prescribed fire. But when it stays really thick, as that water filters through the pine duff, it picks up a lot of chemicals that are actually really hard to then process back out when you're a water provider. So it actually changes, like the tannins and things like that that filter out. And again, this is not my area of expertise. You know, kind of a firefighter understanding of it, but that it essentially reduces water quality, and then in many cases also it suspends that water sometimes in that heavy duff layer, preventing it from actually getting to trees and grass. So basically, I think maybe the short answer is that these ecosystems have evolved over millennia with fire as a present attribute. And so I don't mean to be simplistic, but by reintroducing that process, we have a direct impact on watershed health. And again, there are people who know more about this than I do.
It would be great to have a watershed perspective during our symposium. We have that.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. I think I've never had this many comments in our chat window and perhaps disagreements, and I think it's good. I think it's good to have other opinions, and I appreciate everybody joining us today. We still have 250 people on the webinar, so that's a great sign that you are presenting some really valuable information, and I appreciate you taking time out of your day to bring all of this to us. So everybody keep your eyes out for an email from me with the link to this recording, some helpful links that to some of the documents that we referenced in this webinar, and join us next month. And everybody have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.